Thanks everyone for coming along. We've got the great privilege of having CBCS's own Zachary Amir here today to tell us about his PhD, which he is just completed and maybe ahead. Before we get into that, I might just do a quick acknowledgement of the country. So here at UQ, we acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the land on which we meet here in Meanjin, and we pay our respects to ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connection to country, and we recognise their valuable contributions to Australian political society, and of course their incredible stewardship of biodiversity in Australia. Okay, well, without further ado, I'll hand over to Zach.
There's extra seats around. Yes. Anyway, thanks for the introduction, Jeanette. As stated, my name is Zach, and today we will explore complex tropical forest food webs using camera traps and data science. But before that, I want to give a little bit of background about myself. My first ever research project was actually chasing goannas around Gari as an undergraduate student studying abroad in Australia. And that really set up a passion for reptiles, where after I graduated my undergrad, I was doing conservation and management of threatened reptiles and amphibians, like this timber rattlesnake in Georgia. But I was also really fortunate to spend a lot of time traveling, particularly in Southeast Asia. This photo was taken in the mountains of Malaysia and Borneo. However, on that trip, I kind of realized that I was a passenger in a sea of oil palm plantations, traveling between different islands of tropical rainforests to experience nature and wildlife there. At the same time, I was reading lots of books, knowing that I kind of wanted to head down this ecology pathway, but wasn't totally sure. But I was really interested in this palm oil situation, so I started reading literature as well. I found this paper that described that wild boar actually feed upon the oil palm crop and then increase in density and then degrade nearby intact forests through their nest-making abilities. I thought the research was really interesting, so I decided to contact the lead author, Matthew Luskin, just seeking any sorts of opportunities. He actually responded within 10 minutes saying that was perfect timing. I just got hired at UQ. You should be my first ever PhD student. Seemed like a long shot, but he lured me in with the promise of more fieldwork in Malaysia and Borneo. So with that, I decided to move to Australia in April 2020, 1 week before the international border shut down. Needless to say, the promise of doing international fieldwork was pretty much eliminated right from the beginning. Instead, this is actually how I started my PhD, with the memory cards from lots of different camera traps that Matthew had collected across Southeast Asia. I spent hours and hours poring over camera trap videos like the sandbar deer family from Malaysia and Borneo. And given the circumstances, having to work from a home I'd never lived in, I developed a cyber naturalist mentality and thought this was a pretty good deal. So to start off with, I learned how to sort and manage camera trap data from 21 surveys across 10 landscapes in Southeast Asia, illustrated by these camera traps on the map. I was also learning how to analyze camera trap data, spending a lot of time in R and working through these two key textbooks. And if any of you guys are starting to work with camera traps, I'd highly recommend these two textbooks. In the end, I had over 42,000 independent detections over 100 different wildlife species. With this in mind, I decided I was going to focus on large carnivores. Starting with the largest and arguably the most iconic are tigers. These are listed as endangered according to the IUCN, with key threats proposed being habitat destruction and poaching. Next up are leopards, and while these guys are recognized as vulnerable by the IUCN, this is accounting for leopards in Africa all the way through Asia. The Asian subspecies are doing far worse, such as the Indo-Malayan and Javan leopards are both critically endangered. Key threats listed by the IUCN are habitat destruction, poaching, and for the Asian subspecies in particular, diseases of big risk due to their small population size. Next up, we have clouded leopards, which are technically two species, but throughout these research projects, I've analyzed them as one due to their complete allopatry and shared ecological niches. These have the widest distribution of all the large carnivores in Southeast Asia and are listed as vulnerable, with key threats, again, being habitat destruction and poaching. Finally, the smallest of the large carnivores and the only canine analyzed are dholes. Despite their small size, their pack hunting ability lets them compete with these larger carnivores and take down the similar prey. These guys have been lost from much of their distribution and are listed as endangered, though not very much is known, but it's thought that habitat destruction and loss of key prey species are key threats affecting them. So while large carnivores are interesting, I focused on them primarily because of this review from 2011. They highlighted that the loss or decline of large carnivores across most of Earth's ecosystems have resulted in consistent trophic downgrading, where the extinction of the interactions maintained by these large carnivores degrade ecosystem processes. I decided to zoom in on the example from tropical rainforests and found that it rested on this one citation from 2001. In this paper, they started with a tropical forest, and for one reason or another, they proposed fragmentation. They lost their large carnivores. After large carnivores decline, this reduces their top-down predation on prey, letting them increase in abundance. This increase in prey populations then ultimately degrades plant communities. And this process, with alternating negative and positive pathways across trophic levels, is called a trophic cascade. However, I want to know, since there's been lots of large carnivore extinctions in lots of tropical forests around the world, why haven't we seen more trophic cascades research from tropical forests since 2001? My specific questions I aim to answer is to understand if disturbances are actually causing declines in these large carnivore populations. Then, how can I quantify that top-down regulation from large carnivores suppressing prey populations, and combine this information to understand if large carnivore declines indeed generate trophic cascades in these tropical forests? So to start with my first question, I consulted occurrence records. Using those 10 landscapes in mind, I first wanted to establish if these large carnivores were ever present within the last 12,000 years of these landscapes. I then consulted the IUCN range maps to see if they're thought to still persist there, and confirmed their model persistence with the camera trap data we had collected. Using this data, I was able to quantify local extinctions between landscapes relative to a number of abiotic, biotic, and anthropogenic covariates using generalized linear models, and then looked at count data with the camera trap data to examine the abundance declines using those same covariates within landscapes. And now to highlight some of the results, we've got the 10 landscapes listed from the most degraded on the left and the most intact on the right. Orange cells mean the species went extinct between 50 to 12,000 years ago, while gray cells mean the species went extinct within the last 50 years. And green means the species is still present. The bars totaling on the right side indicate the total number of extinctions, and we can see every single large carnivore suffered extinctions from at least one of these landscapes. To look at abundance trends, we have some results that are not surprising. Clouded leopards exhibit abundance declines with increasing forest loss. We also see some surprising trends like increasing tiger abundance with increasing human population density. As for the two other large carnivores, they are so rare in our data set that we didn't even have enough detections to model their abundance. So clearly there are indeed tropical forests missing large carnivores, but these extirpation patterns were not very obvious. While these 4 most disturbed landscapes had significantly more extirpations than the 6 least disturbed landscapes, there were no significant drivers in those generalized linear models pinpointing a single cause driving extirpations. So this highlights the difficulty in teasing apart the complex and often landscape-specific factors driving extirpation patterns. So this is interesting because we know now that effective protected area management is really important. Some carnivores can persist in degraded forests, such as clouded leopards showing increased abundance near human settlements. And it's also well mirrored by other research in the region, showing bird biomass and species richness for birds and mammals increases in log forests compared to intact or oil palm plantations. We can also see that humans don't always drive declines, as illustrated by that tiger result. But when we looked into the data further, we found that the landscape that had the highest density of tigers also had the highest human population density, but also has the most intense anti-rhino poaching management happening there to help safeguard the last remaining population of Sumatran rhinos. And it's also interesting to note that in Mali's study, they suffered very little poaching pressure in their study sites as well. So it just really highlights the importance of regulating poaching in this region. So on to the second question of quantifying predator-prey interactions. I decided we could look at predator-prey relationships by seeing how prey abundance varies due to predator abundance. The signal we would be looking for in a trophic cascade is this negative relationship, where prey abundance increases as predator abundance declines. We could also observe this flat relationship where predator and prey are not interacting, which could be due to a number of different reasons. We could also observe this positive relationship that's a bit counterintuitive, where predator and prey both increase in abundance together, which is likely driven by an unmeasured variable, such as both thriving in a very healthy forest. Because abundance is on the axis of both of these graphs, we call this a co-abundance relationship. So to implement this, I started with 2 species abundance models. These were initially developed to examine the relative change in the abundance of a subordinate species due to the abundance of a dominant species, and were first developed to look at how invasive frogs might suppress native frogs in Europe. Current approaches have been limited to species with similar detection probabilities and densities, like competitors. So if I wanted to apply this to predator and prey models, I needed to overcome past limitations. Specifically, I wanted to see how prey abundance varies along a gradient of predator abundance. So how are prey when predators are rare, common, or totally absent? And this helps move trophic cascades research away from this binary comparison of present versus absent to examine along a gradient while accounting for environmental conditions within each species abundance formula, like elevation, forest integrity, and human footprint index. Now, the novel approach with this co-abundance model is that we use this past research from my prior research question to inform extirpation patterns, and I created an informed zero-inflated Poisson co-abundance model. So we were able to distinguish between true zeros, when a species went extinct from a landscape, versus false zeros, when the species is present in the landscape but not detected at every sampling location. We know from past research conducted by some CBCSers that classifying the processes that generate zeros reduces the likelihood of making errors and therefore strengthens our ecological insights. As a case study, I looked at the 4 Southeast Asian predator-prey relationships on the screen here, but I chose these species because these are the only large carnivores I even had sufficient detections of to model their abundance patterns. Now, to examine the results, keeping in mind our hypothetical results, I was able to get a significant negative relationship showing that tigers appear to suppress muntjac deer abundance. Tigers and sambar had no clear relationship, which we'll discuss a little bit more later. And clouded leopards exhibited these positive relationships with both deer species, which were probably due to both species avoiding areas that had a lot of poaching pressure. So with that in mind, we'll move on to the next research question. I have a good idea of where large carnivores have been extirpated across Southeast Asia, and now I have this nifty model to quantify predator-prey relationships. But I needed more data to quantify these relationships. I believe it was due to sparse data from tigers and sambar that caused the insignificant relationship here. So with the help of my advisor, I simply asked for help. And we developed a large collaborator camera trapping data set where I was able to standardize lots of different disparate camera trapping sessions into clearly defined surveys for this co-abundance analysis, which increased my surveys by 14 times. I grouped these surveys into spatially defined landscapes, which led to almost 5 times as many landscapes occurring in 7 different countries in Southeast Asia. And the points on the map here denote which large carnivore species are present in these landscapes. And then resample all those cameras into 3 square kilometer sampling units to ensure spatial independence, particularly because a lot of the different data collaborators base their cameras at different distances. And then I accounted for each data provider and variable sampling intensity through time within the detection formula of all these species abundance models. So before we can just test for top-down regulation, it's important to acknowledge that large carnivores obviously rely on prey populations. Past research across India's tiger reserves has found that the tiger reserve's prey density is one of the best predictors of tiger density. However, in a tropical rainforest, prey often occur at very low densities and are very cryptic in these complex habitats. So we need to acknowledge this top-down suppression and bottom-up limitations at the same time. Previously, I only tested for top-down regulation, how prey abundance varies due to predator abundance. To incorporate bottom-up regulation, I simply swapped the directionality of the model to see how predator abundance varies due to prey abundance. And if we look, the axes match the same as the bottom-up graph as the tiger researchers did. So to briefly introduce bottom-up regulation, it understandably starts at the bottom of the food web, where plants support abundant prey populations, which then support abundant large carnivore populations. And this cascade with effects in the same direction, so positive, positive, positive across trophic levels, is known as the bottom-up cascade. And it's interesting to note that bottom-up cascades have been observed in tropical forests in South America and Africa, but this is one of the first tests of bottom-up cascades in Southeast Asia's tropical rainforests. So this leads to 2 alternative hypotheses. Either the wildlife community is primarily regulated from the top down by large carnivores, or large carnivores are more strongly regulated by bottom-up resource availability in the form of prey. I conducted a litter review to determine each large carnivore's preferred prey species to construct these pairwise co-abundance models. Unfortunately, for tigers, leopards, and dole, there were systematic dietary studies conducted for them with pretty specific sets of prey species. As for leopards, there's no dietary studies done on them, so they had the most inclusive of the preferred prey species. And this led to a total of 66 top-down and bottom-up models across 33 co-occurring species pairs. So with all of these different results, we had to quantify support for top-down or bottom-up. We have a histogram where we can have the number of models as the y-axis and the species interaction value as the x-axis, which is simply the slope of the co-abundance relationship. If a lot of the top-down models were significant and negative, we could say the community is top-down regulated. Whereas if a lot of the results were from the bottom-up models were positive and significant, we could say the community is more bottom-up regulated. But notice there can also be a lot of unsupported results as well. Particularly in these complex forests, data experiences low power. So we put our models through rigorous model checks, parameter convergence checks, and also made sure that the direction of the species interaction value matched the direction of the hypothesis. However, it's important to keep in mind that compared to the previous research question, I was running 17 times more co-abundance models. With all the additional sampling units included in the model as well, one of them takes 6.5 days to complete. If I was going to run all of these in a year, or in sequentially on a regular computer, it'd take about a year to complete. Therefore, to run this analysis effectively, we have to use high-performance computers to distribute the analysis so each model runs on its own server all at the same time, which drops that runtime down to about a week. So it actually makes it quite accessible. So to examine the results, keeping our hypothetical results in mind, we can see that there's more support for bottom-up regulation than there is for top-down regulation, although there is still a lot of unsupported results in here as well. As far as the two top-down results, let's take a closer look. Like the previous research question, I found that tiger declines still do increase muntjac abundance. And we know from deciduous forests in North America that when large carnivores become rare, deer can become abundant in overconsumed vegetation. However, this outcome seems pretty unlikely in tropical forests, given the vastly reduced herbivory rates compared to deciduous plants. As for the other top-down result, we found that leopard declines appear to increase pigtailed macaque abundance. This is interesting because leopards have been lost from more than 95% of their range in Southeast Asia, and much of that is supported by degraded forests that now support lots of abundant macaque populations. And macaques are one of the #1 human-wildlife conflict animals in Southeast Asia, so this relationship between leopards, macaques, and degraded landscapes probably deserves a bit more attention. As far as bottom-up control, it's interesting to note that wild boar is a key prey species for every single large carnivore, in addition to several other prey species as well. And this leads to nothing new. We know we need to conserve prey if we want to conserve our large carnivores, first and foremost. So we think bottom-up control might be more common in this rainforest due to the forest's unique superannual mass fruiting events. As illustrated in this graph, the vast majority of trees in a forest will produce all of their fruits and seeds in about 6 weeks, and then go years without producing any other fruits or seeds. And it's these lean times between fruiting events that are thought to weaken top-down control. Similarly, we know extra food resources boost herbivore populations, suggesting strong bottom-up limitations. As discussed, we already have evidence from oil palm and wild boar populations. We also know prey biomass increases near fruit gardens in Peninsular Malaysia as well. Despite this information, recent research is still being published suggesting the ecosystem consequences of large carnivore declines are expected to be more severe in these tropical non-seasonal environments. Now, this is due to the observed positive correlation between herbivore abundance and primary productivity. And while this research was conducted in tropical regions, it was conducted in tropical grasslands. And the key point I want to make here is that primary productivity does not equate to resource availability. In tropical forests, fruits and seeds are often restricted to the canopy. There's incredibly low light availability for understory plants, as illustrated by this infrared camera trap photo taken in the middle of the day. And there's substantial anti-herbivore plant defenses for the few plants that persist in the understory. Therefore, the forest floor of a tropical forest is probably more similar to a low-resource desert than usually appreciated. However, this really only applies for terrestrial vertebrates. All bets are off for birds, insects, and arboreal mammals as well. So, just to wrap up, does it look like carnivores generate trophic cascades? Well, it seems like the removal of large carnivores is not expected to make large changes in prey abundance in tropical forests. However, it's interesting to note that all of this research was conducted behind my computer. I was able to develop pretty standardized and robust data pipelines for data cleaning and data analysis. So in theory, if I was given the opportunity to repeat this project, I could do it quite rapidly. Fortunately, I did have that opportunity to kind of spin the question around and say, does the addition of a novel predator in a tropical forest generate changes in prey abundance? Given the results suggesting strong bottom-up limitations, I didn't think it was going to be very likely, but I had an opportunity to get back to the field from what I was doing prior to my PhD, so I hopped on that opportunity as much as I could, getting my naturalist back out from the computer and back into the forest. So I went up to the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area in North Queensland, and this is a key tropical forest for Australia because it supports more than 30% of Australian mammals, including 14 endemic species. Now, we also know invasive predators have been implicated in the extinction of at least 30 Australian mammals, but as far as the Wet Tropics is concerned, red foxes haven't been detected there yet. So my key questions is I want to know if invasive predators are even impacting these native wildlife populations. And then how do these invasive predators compare to native predators like dingoes? So for this project, I conducted 6 new camera trap surveys from 6 national parks that was completed last year. I combined this with 6 camera trap surveys from Dr. Tom Bruce, who was studying feral cats as part of his PhD at JCU. And then we rapidly verified these images using artificial intelligence from Wildlife Insights, where they have computer vision that automatically recognizes what species is in our images. However, there's a considerable amount of human oversight that went into this process as well, because the Wet Tropics has a lot of strange endemic animals that were never trained on the computer vision. But once all the images were done, we were able to rapidly apply these data analysis pipelines. So to look at some results, starting with feral cats, it's really interesting to note that they actually exhibit many more top-down effects than they would bottom-up effects. I have evidence suggesting that feral cats suppress the populations of 5 different species of native wildlife, including 2 endemic species, the white-tailed rat and the chinchilla. In the case for the white-tailed rat, it doesn't get much better when we have actual camera trap videos of feral cats predating white-tailed rats. As far as dingoes go, they exhibit very few top-down effects, but have more bottom-up effects. We see that it appears like paddy melons, brush turkeys, and maybe cassowaries are important for supporting dingo populations. And as far as top-down effects go, there was one very close to 0 effect on chinchilla populations. So to bring this all together, are these invasive predators impacting wildlife? Well, yeah, invasive cats appear to be suppressing more prey species than tigers do in their native range, which is a pretty interesting statistic. And this really highlights that Australian forests are naive to these feline predators, and maybe these cats could be acting as a super predator in these tropical forests. So as far as invasive predators versus native predators, cats clearly suppress more species than dingoes do. And it's really interesting when we line up the effects of dingoes and tigers, that both of these large carnivores are far more supported from the bottom up than they are from the top down. Finally, I just want to give a quick shout out to the Wildlife Observatory of Australia. This last research project in the Wet Tropics is one of the first research projects to come out of Wild Ops. And this is the group that I've been hired for my postdoctoral research to work as a data scientist. Our aim is to standardize and secure image streams from camera traps all around Australia and efficiently process these images into data sets using AI and image classification systems. Finally, the goal is to collate, curate, and share this national database, hopefully inform policy and research. I'm happy to announce we've recently received funding from lots of key partners here. So the ball is rolling and this is a pretty exciting space to launch. So if you're interested in camera traps and wildlife research, please reach out about this. Finally, I'd just like to thank Matthew and the Ecological Cascades Lab and the Ecological Society of Australia for supporting some of the Wet Tropics research. I'd like to invite you to ask any questions.
Thanks, Zach. Super busy program work for you to share some fascinating results. Yeah, any questions?
Such a cool talk. There's so many great topics in this. One question I have is, what are sort of the time scales? These are like presumably snapshots of abundance, and you might predict, especially for predator and prey, like cycles. And would these trends be strong enough that if you took like peaks and troughs of the cycles, that variation wouldn't really matter, like the
Would even out.
variation in a trend versus?
I think I think that's a key limitation of the research, and it's actually something I wrote a lot about in my thesis as well, is that it is just a static snapshot. The ideal world would be data just from one landscape. It doesn't have to be these 46 that I used, but long-term data, especially if we had a species extinction, whether it be predator and prey. And because predator and prey go through these cycles of increased prey with decreased predators and vice versa, we could really be missampling these wildlife populations. So if we had an example where predators were really dominant over prey, we could say that community is more top-down regulated. But if we sampled it another time, it could be more bottom-up regulated. I'm hopeful that the large number of surveys we had kind of evens this process out, especially because we accounted for sampling years, a random effect in our co-abundance formulas. So the idea is that it evens out, but it is a key limitation.
An online question for you from
Sure.
Marina. She says, great talk, really enjoyed it. Are there any interactions between the cats and the dingoes? Would dingoes ever have an impact on cats?
Yeah, that question is one that the Wildlife Observatory is aiming to answer across Australia. And I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think I would have highlighted that result if it did come out as significant. I'm pretty sure for the wet tropics data, there was no clear effect of dingoes regulating cat populations. And that specific question is something we're going to be working on with a much larger data set across Australia. Yeah.
Really great talk. I was just wondering about kind of what you think of the asymmetry and like if it was top down versus bottom up, there might be a delay more with like if the prey was reduced for some other cause, the predators might be able to live and through starvation live a few more years rather than if you had a bunch of extra predators that would just immediately regulate probably the bottom up. So there'd be kind of delay in terms of like top down would take like pretty instant, whereas bottom up might be a little bit more delayed depending on the species, I imagine. And I was wondering if it's possible to, if you accounted for this or if you can account for that, like to improve the bottom up models, I guess.
I think the way to account for that would be to have a multi-season model, to not take the data as a snapshot in time and to look at trends through time to see how this co-abundance relationship changes through time. I think that would be a key improvement over the method. But as far as lags between an extinction, it's important to note that these are super diverse forests. And while I was able to use these live reviews to come up with a preferred prey species, these predators are super opportunistic. So even if there is one species that goes extinct, it's very often that they could prey switch and choose a different prey species as well. And something that I didn't actually have time to include in the talk, but it's something I've written about a bit, is that wild boars, positive responses to habitat degradation and thriving in oil palm plantations is probably a key reason why these large carnivores can actually persist in these degraded forests. So I think there are some prey species that, particularly wild boar, that will always be around, and that these large carnivores really rely on to persist in degraded forests.
A little bit sort of left of what you were looking at, but did you find any sort of effects of other invasive species inside carnivores and their potential effect on native wildlife, like pigs in Australia?
Yeah, actually, I did include pigs in that analysis, but I have omitted it from the slides here. It's really interesting that pigs didn't show any suppressive effects on wildlife. And we also detected horses at some of our study sites, but there were not enough detections of horses to include in our models as well. No, the pigs really didn't exhibit many effects upon native wildlife. I think as far as invasive species management for the wet tropics region is concerned, if you're interested in taking care of wildlife, you should manage feral cats. If you're interested in protecting vegetation, you should probably be focusing on the pigs. So it's one of these questions of, what's your response variable you're interested in managing?
Just you had a bottom-up effect of cassowaries in there.
Yeah, with the dingoes.
Yeah, how does that work?
Yeah, so I think, and one of the key limitations with this approach as well is that it's all correlative. And there's very likely the likelihood that there could be spurious correlations in the data, particularly from these complex tropical forests where there's lots of different factors at play. There's almost certainly unmeasured variable driving these relationships. And it's been something I've been trying to work through recently about how do we unpack these results to say, okay, which one's really causal and driving this observed relationship, and which one's more likely due to a spurious correlation. I think that cassowary dingo relationship is probably a spurious result.
Okay, thank you.
Probably both of them responding to, intact forests or something like that.
Now, one more thing which we want to consider in the future, one thing that both Mark and I worked on is like the hunting in Southeast Asia, it's pretty common. So usually both predators and prey are not at their carrying capacity, they're very low. So you don't, in some places at least, you don't tend to see these strong relationships like you see in India or in the US. They have animals reaching their carrying capacity of this particular area. So if you can consider carrying capacity of forests into your models, maybe if you account for it, maybe you see some stronger patterns.
Well, the trick is if we had some sort of good hunting variables that we can include in our bunny. Yeah, you know exactly how hard that information is to generate, particularly for 46 different landscapes across Southeast Asia. That has been a contention point for running this analysis, which I think, again, some of those positive significant relationships from the bottom up results could probably be driven by a response of both species avoiding areas with hunting. That we can't properly parse out that variation in the data because we don't have a variable that captures that hunting information.
Got some online comments from Matthew. For that, he says time lags for top down are harder since predators have slower reproductive rates. And also that we could look at bottom up time lags and habitat or areas where there's huge bottom up events like masting events in tropical forests or mice explosions in arid Australia, where we need multiple years of sampling of that same area, which is rare for camera trap data sets. But maybe actually you're kind of solving that by trying to bring together multiple camera trap arrays.
That's the idea of why we did the single season approach. There were some data providers that had, a year or two of sampling, and we would split that up into 3 or 4 surveys within the year and treat them as single season surveys. Yeah, nobody had more than a year or two of continual monitoring.
Any other questions? Any more online?
Oh, I got online.
Okay. Zach, I might ask about the data augmentation process you went through, which you
Sure.
increased your data set by 14 times.
Yeah.
So how did that work? Did you reach out directly? Was it?
Yeah. So we emailed collaborators directly, showed them the first 2 research chapters I had done were published in 2022, and pretty much all of 2023 was building up this big collaborator network and having people share data. Oftentimes we signed memorandums of understanding. So, if they gave us our data, they would be a co-author on the project. So this last research project got 15 co-authors on the paper. And then also they gave us data in all sorts of different formats. And I obviously had to make lots of changes and corrections and re-standardize the data essentially. So I actually made an interactive online Shiny application that I sent out to all of our collaborators, showing them, look, this is the data we're going to use in the analysis. You click your name on the app and that'll show you what data you provided. Here's how I changed it. Are you happy with it? I made all this effort to make the Shiny app. Nobody said anything was wrong. And I was really hoping that they'd be like, no, do this, do that. But no.
Pretty good, you nailed it.
That is debatable.
So that's a pretty good setup for wild ops.
Yeah. So it was that process of bringing together all these collaborators' camera trapping data sets that kind of laid the groundwork for collating this national database of camera trapping records. But it's interesting. I was working in my silo. I had my idea of my end product of what I needed to produce. And now as part of Wild Ops, we're trying to match the Darwin core standards for making data accessible and frictionless for lots of different end users. And we have different perspectives. So I think finding that middle ground and working effectively with that is going to be important. Yeah.
Is the wild ops mostly looking at the cats, or is like you said it was like a much wider project? What other things is that sort of including?
So our key first project, well, I guess, before even looking at the data, we are working on revising a manuscript where we had a big questionnaire sent out to all Australian camera trappers. I think the author of this is like 100, maybe more than that, authors. Where we simply looked at where's camera trapping being done, how's it being done, and what's the camera trap community want. So we're taking a pretty big community approach first, but then ecologically speaking, our first research project that we have planned is to look at dingo, cat, fox interactions across all of Australia, stratified by ecosystem. But something that I'd be really interested in is kind of splitting out smaller single species projects to create research opportunities for like honors through PhD students as well. So I think there's gonna be a lot of opportunity for that as well.
Okay, anything further? Right, well, maybe we'll wrap it up and you.